This bill includes the largest cuts to SNAP in American history. It cuts federal funding for the program by about 30%. It's truly unprecedented.
That was Krista Hesdorfer, Director of Public Affairs at Hunger Solutions New York. And this is Epicenter NYC. We connect our communities to news, information, and each other. I'm your host, Amber Castillo. On July 4th, the Big Beautiful Bill was signed into law, and with it, sweeping changes to food assistance programs that support millions of Americans. Advocates say it includes the largest cuts to SNAP in U.S. history. But this isn't just about food budgets. Many warn of deeper ripple effects on children's health, educational outcomes, and the long-term stability of vulnerable households. To understand how these changes will affect New Yorkers, I spoke with two people on the front lines of food policy, Krista Hesdorfer from Hunger Solutions New York and Debipriya Chatterjee, a senior economist at the Community Service Society of New York. These conversations were recorded just before the bill was signed, but remain deeply relevant as we look ahead to how this law will be implemented. Before we jump in, a quick message from our team.
Hi, I'm Mariana from the Epicenter NYC team with a quick health update. Flu, RSV, COVID, and stomach viruses are creating an epidemic, making public spaces, including schools, virus hotspots. Watch for norovirus symptoms like vomiting, RSV's sneezing and congestion, and the flu's high fevers and fatigue. Hydration, rest, and staying home when sick help keep families healthy. Protect your community. Wash your hands, clean surfaces, and keep up with vaccines. Need more info? Email hello@epicenter-nyc.com or text 917-818-2690.
Now back to the show. Here's my conversation with Krista.
I'm Krista Hesdorfer. I serve as the Director of Public Affairs for Hunger Solutions New York. And our focus is maximizing the reach and effectiveness of federal nutrition assistance programs like SNAP, WIC, school meals, summer EBT, and other child nutrition programs.
I imagine folks in the food access space, as you guys are, have been paying attention to this bill that the Senate just passed. In terms of SNAP benefits, what are the most significant changes to SNAP that you're seeing in the current iteration of the bill?
This bill includes the largest cuts to SNAP in American history. It cuts federal funding for the program by about 30%. It's truly unprecedented. Here in New York, it would mean benefit cuts for all 2.9 million New Yorkers who rely on the program, but it would also put about 300,000 families at risk of losing some or all of their household SNAP benefits.
What are the levers of these changes in the bill?
The cuts to SNAP are made in a few different ways in the bill. There's a shifting of federal funds in which the bill cuts federal funding and forces states to try and fill the gap, even though Congress knows that state budgets can't absorb this massive cost. The bill also expands work reporting requirements that essentially place a time limit on how long people can receive SNAP benefits. And to be clear, SNAP already has work requirements, and anyone who is subject to them can only receive SNAP benefits for 3 months in a 3-year period unless they can document sufficient work hours. What this bill does is expand those work reporting requirements to more people, including older adults and households with school-aged children. It also ends exemptions for veterans, people who are homeless, and youth aging out of foster care.
Would this bill change how much paperwork is required for folks to prove that they work or that they qualify?
Yes, absolutely. So these work reporting requirements should really be called paperwork requirements because that's really all they do is add paperwork and red tape that makes it harder to access the program. The majority of SNAP participants who can work already do. So this expansion of work reporting requirements just adds layers of bureaucracy for folks who are already struggling to make ends meet, who may not have control over the amount of hours they get from their jobs, and now they have to jump through additional hoops just to get the food assistance they need to put food on the table. implementation side that we'll start to see how this rolls out and how the state implements the requirements. But families would need to prove if they're subject to the work reporting requirements, they would need to prove that they're working at least 80 hours a month.
Could you elaborate a bit on who is already most vulnerable to issues with food access or food security, and how that would be compounded by the groups that are going to be more affected if this bill goes through?
So, about 2.9 million New Yorkers currently rely on SNAP to help put food on the table. 30% of those SNAP participants in New York are children, and 31% are seniors or people with disabilities. And we know that food insecurity disproportionately affects households with children, communities of color, older adults, these populations who are especially vulnerable and who may face additional barriers to finding and keeping employment that would allow them to meet these types of work reporting requirements. So, when we think about the folks who will be harmed by this bill, it's real people, it's New Yorkers. Like, if you imagine a 63-year-old who just lost their job, this bill would now kick them off of SNAP after 3 months if they can't find a job and prove that that job has given them enough hours, jump through all those red hoops to submit the paperwork to their caseworker. That's a real person who is now not going to be able to put food on the table because of a bill that's primarily intended to fund tax cuts that favor the wealthy. It's really unacceptable.
What would be the impact also on local food banks if these SNAP cuts go into effect?
Food banks can't fill the gap. For every one meal that a food bank or food pantry provides, SNAP provides 9 meals. Food banks are also already reeling from federal cuts over the last few months. So they're working with fewer resources. And many of the folks that I talk to who work in food banks are terrified that they're not going to be able to meet their community's needs in the months and years ahead.
Yeah, how likely is it that we would see or more New Yorkers who would otherwise, qualify for SNAP rely on these kinds of informal groups that became, even more visible during the pandemic?
There's no question that this bill will increase hunger in New York. It will increase healthcare costs. It will make it harder for families to meet their basic needs. And so, of course, yes, we will see an increase in demand on those local emergency food resources and other charitable organizations, one time grant funding that just can't match the scale or sustainability of a federal program like SNAP.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if you could speak about immigrants with a certain legal status. I've heard from some advocates at work in the food security space that there was already apprehension around the documentation and the visibility of applying for safety net programs. That was increased in this second Trump administration. I'm wondering if you could just speak to the compounded barrier that might exist for immigrants with a certain status to even apply for programs like SNAP.
Eligibility for SNAP is already very strict. Undocumented immigrants are not eligible for SNAP, and many lawfully present immigrants need to wait at least 5 years before applying. This bill that just passed in the Senate further restricts eligibility for lawfully present immigrants. It would remove SNAP eligibility for about 25,000 New Yorkers who are refugees, asylees, or other lawfully present immigrants whose statuses don't align with what's now allowable in that bill. So, that chilling effect that we've seen on immigrant participation in basic needs programs is now compounded by the reality of additional cuts to eligibility for the programs. So it creates an environment where it's terrifying to access programs that you really need to feed your family. And in some cases now creates actual practical barriers to receiving those programs because you may not be able to clear those hurdles for eligibility.
To help make sense of the broader economic and policy forces behind this legislation, I also spoke with Debipriya Chatterjee from the Community Service Society of New York. She explained how the bill shifts some of the financial burden of SNAP from the federal government to states and why that could leave hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers without support.
So my name is Debipriya Chatterjee, and I'm a senior economist with the Community Service Society of New York.
And what does your work focus on?
So CSS is a 80-year-old organization devoted to working to improve lives of low-income New Yorkers. I work in labor economics, including gender and pay equity, working for transit affordability. Fair fares is one of the things that we got going, and it has helped about 360,000 New Yorkers. I also work a lot with youth and their disconnection from labor market kind of issues. Also work to support our housing team who are looking into housing affordability because housing is the big chunk of people's paychecks in New York City. And I also look at broad issues of poverty, inequality, tax policy, and things like that.
I was hoping we could speak about this version of Trump's big beautiful bill that some are calling big ugly bill, including our governor, and what that might mean for SNAP benefits.
So it definitely is like it's hard to find anything beautiful in that bill. So it's a massive redistribution from the poor and working class Americans or working Americans to the super rich. Like there's no other way to put it. This is not a political statement. It's just an empirical fact at this point. And one of the mechanisms through which they are doing it is because to fund the tax cuts for the very high income earners is they are trying to reduce direct spending on programs and services that federal government has traditionally been providing. That would hit almost all domains of our lives, from housing to energy assistance to education to everything else. But SNAP cuts, which is the Supplemental and Nutritional Assistance Program, is one of the big items on the chopping block. And the way it is playing out is the bill cuts around 186 billion from SNAP funding over 10 years. And 40 million people over country nationwide rely on SNAP, of them about 3 million in New York. In New York, among those who receive SNAP, 30% are children, 21% are elderly, and 10% are disabled. So, if you sum these categories, you will see that a majority of SNAP recipients are really these vulnerable members. And the way this will play out is either a state will have to somehow find money for that to make that contribution happen by cutting other programs and other assistance, and we know none of them are really dispensable, or they will say that we can contribute only up to X%, and so we can provide SNAP to only a smaller subset of the population. So, for example, in New York, if 2.9 million people currently receive SNAP, if New York tomorrow were, or starting 2028, was to shoulder 15% of the burden, it might say that I cannot provide SNAP for 3 million people. I can only provide for 1.5 million people, or I can only provide for, say, 1.8 million people. And so that's how a lot of cuts will play out, that people will be pushed off of the program. And then there's the other third bad scenario where the state would say that I cannot come up with that money, and they would then have to opt out entirely of the program. So that's built into that bill, which is a very dire scenario where the state is saying that because I could not come up with my contribution, the federal government is like, okay, so now we are not going to provide you with the remaining 85%. It might seem a little technical, but it's an important point here, that the way this percentage of like what share your state needs to contribute from 5 to 15, so which number between 5 and 15 they will have to contribute, depends on something that they are calling the error rate. So the error rate is a highly volatile, it varies a lot from year to year. What they are trying to get at is that the error rate is a proxy indicator for fraud. In most cases, it's just like small administrative mistakes happening in the paperwork or something, either on the state worker side or among the recipients. It's not evidence of fraud. But the federal government, the BBBA bill says that if your error rate is higher than, say, 6%, then you are going to have to pay up to 15% of your, or 15% or 10% of your towards the contribution. So, A, it's shifting cost to states, and B, they are using a mechanism which is very faulty and at its core is an unreliable measure for anything. And, at the very last moment, one of the things that was pushed into was Alaska was carved out of this rule because they said, their error rate is way higher. So New York also, for example, has an error rate of 14% over the last 2 years. So technically, it would mean New York would have to shoulder 15% of the SNAP tab, which is around $7.2 billion a year. The impact would be considerable. These are the ways through which, well, like we say, SNAP are being cut. Like how exactly? One way is cost shift to state. The other is by expanding work requirements. And so in New York, these additional work requirements will cause 281,000 adults in New York State to lose SNAP eligibility, and another 413,000 to be at risk of losing eligibility. And then an additional 363,000 children who live with these adults may subsequently lose access to SNAP. The impact on children has much longer repercussions and impact on long-term outcomes than impact on adults, right? So that's even more worrying.
And you had mentioned 2028 before. How quickly could New Yorkers see these SNAP changes take effect?
So here's the thing, they are doing it in a way so that these would take effect after the midterms. So it's like you and I, we can go on harping about these cuts coming, but people would not feel it until it's pretty late. So 2028 is when things would kind of go into effect. So 2028, if no other major changes or amendments to this bill get done by then New York would, based on its error rate for 2025 or 2026, would then have to find money to pay for SNAP going forward.
Would anything change in terms of the documentation New Yorkers would need?
Yeah, I think the eligibility rules are going to become much labyrinthine, much more labyrinthine than they are now. One of the things we worked on or last year was looking at food insecurity, and food insecurity is about one in four New Yorkers are food insecure. The rate with households with children is about 27%. So what I'm worried about is these households that are already food insecure, have children in them that are struggling to put food on the table, how they are going to be affected, broadly speaking. At the end of the day, they would have reduced access, and there would be greater obfuscation, there would be greater nervousness around interacting, around establishing your eligibility. And all of this, it has been shown, puts a lot more burden on low income people in proving their eligibility. And this is where people who work, so they have to take time off of work to show up to access centers in person, wait there the whole day, miss a day of wages. So all of these have repercussions.
And for those New Yorkers who do lose benefits should these changes go through, are there other city food programs or emergency food resources that wouldn't be impacted by this?
Yeah, so the community food program, I think CFC, Community Food Center programs, that plays a major role. There is Mayor's Office for Food Policy has put together some resources for this, and there are city and state resources, but like you said. We will have to see how much of this can continue in the face of increased spending demands, as well as an economy that's not booming anymore, right? So with all these cuts, with all these deficits, the fears for the economy slowing down are real. When that happens, the state's overall revenue falls. Now, within from a smaller revenue state and the city, we have to carve it out to pay for SNAP. And so then it's like a domino effect for all other programs.
How much power would the new mayor have in kind of deciding what happens with some of these funded programs in the city?
They would have definitely a lot of the city budget. They can alter the amounts that are put in the city budgets. These are at the city level levers that they can pull, and I think that they would, whoever is the mayor, given the snap cuts coming down the pipe, they would definitely try to shore up funding for nutrition assistance at the requisite level. But there are these city programs that do help, and that will have a made more like a bigger impact now that SNAP is not something we can 100% rely on.
And is there anything we didn't discuss that you think is just important for New Yorkers to know, especially those who might be affected?
The rhetoric around the bill is what we need to probably change, right? It's not wasteful spending. It's not people who are not working and just living off of SNAP. People are working, they have caregiving duties, or they are sick, or they are disabled. And so these extra red tapes are not going to have any impact.
Though the big, beautiful bill has now become law, its effects won't hit all at once, but they will be felt, especially starting in 2028. States will be asked to do more with less. And low-income families, immigrants, and children could face new hurdles to getting the support they need. We'll continue to follow how this story unfolds. For more reporting and resources, head to epicenter-nyc.com. That's all for today. Thanks for listening, and thanks for supporting us as we do our best to support our community. We couldn't do it without you. Our intro music is All the Pretty Horses by Karavika. You can find more of their music on their website, linked to in our podcast description.